I used to get sunburns all the time. So I am pretty fair skinned. I have very light blue eyes. And so I used to be extremely skeptical of getting too much sunlight exposure both onto my skin and into my eyes. Um, because anytime I would go out there, I would burn. And so I started to, as I started diving deeper and deeper into this idea that the sun was beneficial and not harmful, it really kind of was a paradigm shift for me to realize that the sun isn't out to get me. I was just never truly adapting appropriately to the sunlight. My behaviors were the issue, not the sun. The sun wasn't inherently bad or, trying to give me a sunburn anytime I stepped outside. And so the way that I like to teach this is by talking about how modern humans use sunlight. And I do also want to go a little bit into the historical use of sunlight as well. So we can see a comparison about when sunlight was used in heliotherapy clinics and was very healing, and then kind of what happened from then on to cause us to fear the sun. I'll start with heliotherapy actually, because I think it's a fascinating topic. So as I started to learn more and more about the health benefits of sunlight, I realized that there were these what were called heliotherapy clinics back in Europe in the late early 1900s. And these were clinics that were set on literal mountaintops and purposefully chosen at high elevation, because the higher up you go in elevation, the stronger the ultraviolet light is. And these clinics were run by people like Dr. Auguste Rollier, who had a very slow procedure of wheeling patients into more and more sunlight, very slowly and progressively, and getting their bodies to adapt to receiving more and more sunlight at higher and higher intensities and durations. So for example, day one, the patient would get wheeled out into full spectrum, strong ultraviolet sunlight, and they would expose their feet and ankles for a minute and then roll them back in. And then the next day, they would roll them out at the same time, expose their feet and ankles for a minute, and then expose the rest of their legs for a minute, roll them back inside. And then they would roll them back out, feet and ankles for a minute, the rest of the legs for a minute, and then the abdomen, right? So slowly and progressively, they would adapt until these people were bathing in full body sun exposure, to the extent that if you look at pictures back in the day that were being utilized or that were being taken for people utilizing heliotherapy clinics, people would go in with a very, very much less melanation in their skin than they would after they came out. They would be highly tanned when they came out. And with those before and after pictures came comments such as tuberculosis went away, this particular infectious disease went away, autoimmune conditions went away, cancer went away. So at the time, Dr. Rollier and his colleagues had figured out how to use sunlight and fresh air, mind you, to cure over 120 different disease conditions. At the same time, in the United States, or just in the laboratory settings in general, they were studying the effects of ultraviolet light on petri dishes of cells. And they would take these UV arc lamps, which are high intense UV light lamps that have nothing to do with like the same blend of red and infrared that you get from sunlight, which are very soothing and anti-inflammatory. And they were shining these narrow band, high intensity ultraviolet light sources at these cells, and we're seeing things like DNA mutations and damage, oxidative stress, that stuff. And so from that line of research came researchers to say, oh, we cannot, ultraviolet light can't be beneficial. It's causing DNA mutations. It's causing damage. It's increasing inflammation in these petri dishes. Meanwhile, the UV arc lamp was nothing like full spectrum sunlight and nothing like the slow progressive adaptation that was being utilized in these heliotherapy clinics. This research clearly, started to win out to show that to quote unquote prove that ultraviolet light is damaging. And then it got to the point where they said, okay, well, let's start to study this effect on animals. Well, the animals that they've chosen in this research were animals such as hairless mice and hairless rats. Not only are these creatures nocturnal, meaning they're not meant to be out ever in ultraviolet light, they also don't have hair. Hair is another way that we can protect ourselves from overexposure to ultraviolet light. And then when they would shine this arc lamp on these creatures, it would show, oh yeah, look, same thing's happening. We're seeing these mutations and things like that. And so that's the line of thinking and reasoning that won out about ultraviolet light, and then started the industries of things like sunscreen, sunglasses. The eye research is almost even more horrifying because when and this you can read about in a book that's called Health and Light by John Ott, who was a really well-known photographer at the time, and he started to recognize that lighting affected. He would do this like stop motion photography, or would essentially do photography that would show progressive plant growth. And he realized that the lighting environment in which the plant was growing drastically affected its growth. And so that started to get him down the line of, well, what light is beneficial versus what light might be detrimental. And so he dove into the research and wrote this beautiful book called Health and Light. And in this book, he highlighted several research studies where they were studying the harmful effects of ultraviolet light on the eyes. But in order to do so, they were first dilating animals' eyes. And this particular study that I'm highlighting was monkeys, dilated their eyes so that their pupils couldn't contract in response to the more intense light. And then they pried their eyes open so that they couldn't blink in response to the more intense ultraviolet light. And then they literally did the same thing, shined a very intense narrowband ultraviolet light source into the eyes of these creatures. And eventually you saw what would be inflammatory cascades that could lead to things like macular degeneration, glaucoma. And so again, that led to the line of thinking that ultraviolet light is damaging to the eyes. We got to protect them at all times. And then fast forward, there was, in the 1990s or so, there was this awareness about vitamin D. And because we'd already feared the sun, we thought that, well, we're seeing low vitamin D levels in everyone. Let's supplement vitamin D since it's too scary to make it through sunlight. People can't possibly, it's not safe to make vitamin D through sunlight on the skin, that intense ultraviolet light on the skin. Let's supplement vitamin D. And those studies on vitamin D supplementation actually don't pan out in the same way of being cancer preventative, in the same means of improving all-cause mortality and stuff like that. And so that's a whole nother industry that was kind of developed, of this vitamin D supplementation. All of these are sun avoidance industries. And what I'm saying is, the sun's not out to get us. We have been misusing the sun. And the way that I personally used to misuse the sun was a very typical thing that you'll see happen here is in places like where I live, like in Michigan, where it's kind of cold and dreary up until Memorial Day. Even though from essentially the winter solstice onward, the days are getting longer. As the days are getting longer, the intensity of the ultraviolet light is getting stronger and stronger, to the extent that just last week, ultraviolet B finally reappeared. And that was at the very end of January. Ultraviolet light finally appeared where I live. That ultraviolet B, which is the strongest wavelength range of ultraviolet light that we're going to get from the sun, will then start to increase in duration and intensity up until the summer solstice. And so I literally have had, from the end of December through now, and then all the way up until the winter, or up until the summer solstice, to slowly and progressively adapt my body to ever increasing amounts and intensities of ultraviolet light. So, but what I typically did was wait until Memorial Day, because by Memorial Day, we're lucky it's maybe 70, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a long weekend, so it's a holiday weekend, and there would be barbecues. And so my skin wouldn't see the light of day up until that moment in time. And then on Memorial weekend, I'd go out to someone's house for a barbecue, or have a barbecue at my house. And I would, be in maybe a short sleeve shirt or have a tank top on, nothing on my face. And then I'd be under the sun for hours and I would burn. And then I would blame the sun and say, see, I knew the sun was harmful. Why did I let that happen? Why did I let it attack me like that and burn me? A lot of the times I was wearing sunglasses too. And sunglasses do something entirely different that I'm not going to go into detail here, but they really confuse the brain-skin communication, because the skin has built-in endogenous protective factors in our skin that we can slowly adapt to, create this solar adaptation so that we can receive more and more benefits of sunlight without getting that really strong, aggressive sunburn. And so when I started to slowly recognize that spring was an amazing time for me to start to get my skin accustomed to the less intense ultraviolet light, and slowly start to build in those endogenous sun factors, including a ever slowly increasing concentration of melanin in my skin, I reached a point in the summer where I no longer burned. I don't burn anymore. I didn't even burn to begin with, right? Like when I started to slowly adapt. Sure, there would be signs and signals. I teach about these signs and signals in places like the upcoming Spring Reset Challenge, where I talk about what signals your skin is giving to you to tell you, okay, you've had enough, which aren't actually a burn, but it's just the signal that, yep, that's enough for this session. Go ahead and pull yourself out of the sun. And so when I started to adapt my skin to these signals and to more and more intense ultraviolet light, I can spend 3 weeks in the end of July, beginning of August at our family's lake house and not put on any sunscreen from sunrise till sunset and not burn, because my skin knows how to adapt. My body knows how to receive that intense sunlight and what to do with it. And heck, I feel really darn good getting that sunlight on my body. I feel really darn good getting that intense sunlight on my abdomen. There's some amazing things it can do for gut health. And so I highly encourage you to look at maybe how you used to utilize the sun, and maybe your skin's response to not having a consistent adaptation process, and instead high intensity intermittent exposures, perhaps with sunglasses on, that would ultimately result in sunburns. So that being said, I really am so excited to teach through this Spring Reset Challenge, teach how to slowly allow your skin to adapt to more and more ultraviolet light so you can derive the many benefits of light on the skin. Remember, those benefits are, especially in the ultraviolet range that we're taught to fear, go beyond making vitamin D. But that vitamin D is essential because remember, we make not just one version of vitamin D when we do it that way, but we make dozens of metabolites that are very beneficial as well and can account for some of the anti-cancer effects of when we make vitamin D through the skin as opposed to vitamin D supplementation. So it's an important thing to have happen. That ultraviolet A on the skin, it can help to vasodilate the blood vessels for blood pressure. It can regulate metabolism. I mean, there's so many amazing things that we can talk about when we allow that light to touch our skin, and we can do so without fearing it. And when we can actually just essentially glorify in the life-giving energies that it's giving our bodies. So highly encourage you to reframe how you view the sun. It's not out to get us. Perhaps we didn't have the correct strategy in order to apply that light correctly to allow our skin to adapt to receiving all of the sun's healing benefits.